Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Saturday, December the 31st, 2022, last day of the year. And the last day of our daily devotion look at the Christmas story, at least according to Luke 2, verses 1 through 7, focusing on that final verse, verse 7 this morning, which reads as follows: "And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in bands of cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn." Interesting thing here, too. The birth of Jesus, as we have it there, kind of fits in with what we know about the cultural and geographical context of the first century. Traveling would have been difficult, so that trip from Nazareth to Bethlehem. So most houses back then had a guest room or lodging place called a kataluma, where travelers could eat or sleep for a period of time. And this is the word that's usually, though incorrectly, translated as in verse 2:7. So it's really more properly like a guest room. So there was no, and we have it now in the translation in the NRSV, no place. It used to say no room for them in the inn. It sounded like they were looking for the Holiday Inn and there was no rooms left. No, there was no place for them in the guest room, is one way of looking at it. So the kataluma, you would stay with the family. There were proper inns. The only one that's mentioned in the New Testament, though, is the one mentioned in the parable of the Good Samaritan. It seems as though proper, at least legitimate inns were not a significant reality in first century Judea. So people tended to stay in the homes of others, particularly people, relatives or friends. But here's the thing: village houses of the first century were composed of a number of small rooms and open courtyards with no fixed floor plan. The houses differed slightly, but for the most part, rooms that were more private tended to be toward the back of the house, while spaces for public activities like wedding feasts, interestingly enough, or acts of hospitality, were up front closer to the street. So some of the rooms were reserved, or some of the rooms in the front or the courtyards were reserved for the family's animals as well. And they might have been brought into the household compound in times of danger or inclement weather. Very practical reason: many times their body heat slightly warmed the living spaces of the residents. A lot of homes, especially in the hill country, would have multiple stories, especially if the house was built on a slope. In this case, the room for the animals was typically in the lower story, while the family lived above. In any case, the kataluma served guests rather than the persons who were the permanent residents of the home, and it would have been, again, in the front of the house, close to the street. The question of why there was no room in the guest room, no space in the guest room, is that perhaps it was being used for another purpose. Perhaps there were other guests, or, and this is the most intriguing thing, perhaps it was simply not appropriate for someone to give birth. Another way of translating Luke 2, verse 7 is that there was no room there for that, referring to the birth. It's supported by birthing practices that have been documented in traditional village homes in places such as Bethlehem, all the way prior to the introduction of hospitals in modern times. Because at the moment of birth, the expectant mother would go to a room where the animals were normally kept, in other words, the stable, to give birth, and only later was brought back up into the living space of the housing compound. And also, it's interesting to think that because this was the time of the year when we were told that the shepherds were out in the fields, the stable of the house might very likely have been empty or used for storage and not filled with live animals. Stephen C. Carlson writes kind of a conclusion, kind of wrapping up everything we've been talking about. He says, Luke's infancy narrative presupposes the following events. Joseph took his betrothed, Mary, from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Bethlehem was his hometown, and in accordance with the marital customs of the day, it must have also been the place where they finalized their matrimonial arrangements by bringing her into his home. As the newly married man, he no longer would have to sleep in the main room of the village house with his other relatives, but he and his bride could stay in a marital chamber attached to the house until they could get a place of their own. And they stayed there until she came to full term, verse 6. And she gave birth to Jesus in the main part of the house rather than in the marital apartment because it was too small. And she laid the newborn in one of the mangers that were common to the main room of an ancient farmhouse. As he says, to be sure, this scenario presupposed in Luke's infancy account diverges greatly from the conventional Christmas story we've all grown up with. There's no inn, no innkeeper, no stable, but it's grounded in careful exegesis or translation of the text. The term kataluma has a broad sense of place to stay, so that final clause of Luke 2:7 should be translated as because there had no space in their place to stay. And so that we kind of, to wrap things up, a possible scenario of what happened would be as follows. Mary's home was in Nazareth in Galilee. Joseph's home, as well as his ancestral home, was in Bethlehem. They may have met either during one of Mary's trips down to visit her relatives in Judea or while Joseph was in the Nazareth area, being a builder, carpenter, stonemason. He may have moved there temporarily to undertake work. The census, one that was, or the first census or the beginning of a census, would have been when people were summoned to their hometowns. So Joseph returned to Bethlehem. He took Mary with him, partly to protect and care for her, and partly because they intended to finalize their marriage and make Bethlehem their home. When they reached Bethlehem, they stayed in the house of Joseph and his family or relatives. There was insufficient space, however, in the guest room for Mary to give birth and care for the baby and to also accommodate the midwife and others who had been in attendance. So Mary gave birth downstairs near the animals' night quarters. The baby was laid then in the animals' feeding trough. Of course, that was the sign that was given to the shepherds by the angels. And then they made the short trip from there to Jerusalem for the purification rites. And after some time, of course, kind of wrap it into Matthew's story, the Magi arrived, saw the child. Joseph gets warned in a dream to take his family to Egypt. And after a year or so there, news came that Herod was dead. And Joseph may have considered taking his family back to Bethlehem, but Archelaus, who was now reigning in place of his father Herod the Great, was just as dangerous. So they made their home in Nazareth, Mary's hometown, instead. I know this has been a little bit longer one. We kind of want to wrap everything up and just to say, this is another way of looking at the Christmas story. In some ways, the idea that Joseph would have gone to his own hometown to register for tax purposes makes more sense than the ancestral home. And this idea that people are crisscrossing all over the Roman Empire to go to their hometowns, like I keep saying, me going up to Scranton, why? Especially for tax purposes. The idea that Mary's from Nazareth, Joseph, though, is from Bethlehem is intriguing. They may have met when she came down and visited in the hill country. They may have met because Joseph, or a combination of Joseph going up there to work, in which case the betrothal part of the marriage started in Nazareth. He has to go back to register for the census or for tax purposes, and he takes her back to Bethlehem to finalize the marriage at his home. And it was not an inn. It was not a Hampton Inn or something that they didn't find room. It was just that the accommodations in the house, in his house, his family's house, were not sufficient to give birth. So they might have started out in a small guest room. They ended up going into the main part of the house, the lower level, where the animals were often stabled, and the newborn child was laid in the manger, the feeding trough. Interesting way of looking at it. Very intriguing. Makes a lot of sense to me. Maybe it doesn't to you. It certainly flies in the face of all that we've been told, but there's good scholarly thoughts and if not proof, at least suggestions of that maybe it happened a different way. So hopefully this was enlightening to you. It certainly was for me, and that's why I wanted to share it with you. We're going to have the story in Matthew of the visit of the Magi on Sunday tomorrow. So hope you can join us and be there either in person or online. There's only the one service though at 9:30. Until then, take care, and then we'll see you next week for another week of daily devotions. Bye.